Previously in this course, we learned a little bit about data definition language, which was how we created tables and constraints and things like that. So now we're going to start getting into data manipulation language, or DML, and DML is how we manipulate the data that we have. This could be inserting new data, which we kind of already learned how to do, but also making changes to data in our database and deleting data from our database. So that would be insert, delete, and update. So those are the three keywords we're going to look at in this unit, as well as transaction management. When you're selecting data, transaction management isn't that important, although we'll talk about some ways you could use that because you're just selecting data to look at it, right? But if you're going to make changes to data, think about it this way. If you're going to make a change to something, how do you make sure that no one else is making changes while you're trying to make changes? Or how do I make sure that that we don't corrupt the data if we're both updating at the same time? So that's kind of what we talk about with transaction management in this unit, although there's other uses for it as well. So let's get started. So I'm going to go into the SQL workshop so I can run some SQL commands. So I'm just waiting for, here we go, it's loading. All right, so let's start with the syntax for inserting records into a table. And I think we've kind of done this before a few times, but here is the syntax. So insert into some table name, and then your list of columns is optional, and then you have your values. Again, that's and that has to match exactly with your list of columns. So if you decide not to use the column names, not to list the columns that you want to insert into, and that means that your values have to be exactly the same as the number of columns in the table, because the database engine doesn't know which columns you want to insert, right? So it's just going to assume that you want to insert all of the columns, and they have to be in the correct order. They have to be in the same order in which they appear in the database. So if you were to do a select statement first, that order that you see the columns in the select statement will be the same that you're going to use for the insert statement, unless you've reordered the columns, right? So if you do select star, that would be the correct order. But if you do select and then list a bunch of column names, then of course that's not going to be a valid test. In any event, that's basically how we're going to do an insert statement. Let me show you an example here. So let me paste this in. So I'm going to do an insert into the account manager table. So let's see what that looks like. So there's our account manager table. So I've left off the column definition, right? So I don't have the column names. And this statement should work even without the column names, because this is the exact number of columns that we have in which we can insert records. There's one more column in this table, and I'll talk about later what that column is and why I'm not inserting into it. So let me go ahead and delete my syntax, and we'll hit run, and let's see if it inserts. All right, looks like we got an error. It says not enough values. And the reason we're getting that error is because clearly I'm missing some values, right? Because I didn't list my columns. I have to have all of the columns defined. So clearly I'm missing something. So instead of trying to figure it out, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do an insert statement this time that includes the column names. So let's try this. So now you can see I'm listing the column names. Okay, so I have the account manager ID, their first name, last name, salary, their commission, and the region. And you can see down here they all match up perfectly with that. So this should work. Let's see if that works. All right, and there we go. So I was able to insert that record. So that worked. All right, let's try another example. So one of the other things that, one of the other issues is, what do we do if we want to insert something that's null? So you've got a couple different options here to insert null values. One option is to explicitly insert the value as null. So if you insert the keyword null, it's going to insert nothing into that column. Not zero or blank or anything like that. It's just going to be nothing. Now it's important to note that something like this, let me paste another example here. Something like this is a little bit different, right? This is not null, an empty string. An empty string is just that, an empty string, but it's still a value. So this is not going to be treated as null if I insert that. Both of these statements will work, but they'll have different values. If I were to do a select statement with this one, you would just see an empty string. You would see nothing in the column, but there would be data there. There's just nothing in it. Whereas this one, you would get a null value, meaning that column is simply not present. So both of these should work. Let's go ahead and run this and see if it... Oh, I forgot. We have to put our semicolons here. Sometimes Oracle's a little persnickety about having those semicolons. All right, so one of them did not work. So let's take a look at this real quick. I'm guessing that Apex doesn't allow us to batch the command, so I ran this one by itself and it worked fine. So this is the one where I inserted the null value. And let's go ahead and see what happens when we try to insert the version of this without the null value, instead trying to insert an empty string. And it worked. So I did it two ways, once as a null value and another time as an empty string. And just to see what happened, let's go ahead and do a select statement. Okay, now, so we only have 3 records because it's just the things that I've inserted. But you can see Mandy Lopez is in here twice because I inserted it twice. And we have two columns with no value in it, as you can see here. All right, so next we are going to add a default value. So let me go ahead and alter the table. We actually learned about this last week in this course. So we actually talked about this already. But what we're going to do is on the AM sal, so the account manager salary, if I don't put anything in there, right? So if I leave that null, here's the problem. If you leave this null, then their earn will end up being null as well if you're trying to calculate it, right? Now, AM earn is a special field. AM earn is not something that we populate when we do an insert statement. In fact, if I tried to insert a value here, it would fail. Because if you were to look at the schema of this table when we created it with our SQL script, this is a calculated value. So we did that in the first couple of units in the course. We created our tables, and we learned about the create table statement. And one of the things I showed you was how to create a calculated column. And this is a perfect example of that. So this calculated column is basically AM sal plus AM commission, right? So it's these added together. I think they're added together. Yes, they are. They're added together. And that gives you the sum over here on the end. So we don't actually insert a value here. Now, like I said, if we were to put a null into any of these fields, a null is interpreted as nothing, which is then added to this, which ends up with null, right? If you add something to nothing, you end up with nothing in Oracle or in any SQL engine. So let's go ahead and make a change so that if somebody were to try to put a null value into this column, instead it'll make it a 0. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and run this. Hopefully that'll make our change, and it didn't. It looks like I'm missing something. So let's see if we can figure out what I'm missing here. Well, if you're trying this on your own, it's not going to work, that command. I just realized that we are using Oracle 11G. So if you're using the Apex or the Application Express server that we provided for this course, it's one version behind the textbook, and that syntax for on default null does not work until you get to version 12. So that command won't work, so we'll skip that one for now. So that's the default on null. So you'll see that in the textbook, but it is not going to work with the it's not going to work with the with our test server that we're using. All right, so let's go back and take a look at those values again just to see what we have. All right, so here's the values that we have. As I mentioned before, we cannot insert into that calculated column. I'm going to show you an example of that. So if I tried to insert into the earn column, right? If I try to put a value in there, even though that's the right calculated value, it's not going to let me do that because, again, it's a calculated value. So I should see an error if I try to run this statement. And there we go. I get it. Oops, I think because I highlighted, only ran what I highlighted. There we go. So it disallowed, operation disallowed on virtual columns. So really, the account manager earn column is a virtual column that's calculated. It's not going to let me insert a value into that, so we can't do that. All right, so we know a little bit about inserting now. One more thing I want to tell you about inserting is let me do this for you. Let me grab. So let's say, well, let's do this first. So let's select from account bonus. Let's take a look at that table. Whoops, maybe I don't have the account bonus table. Let me check. right, well, I don't have that table, so let's go ahead and create it. So we're going to create a table called account bonus, right? So this is going to give us a place to store the bonuses for our account managers. And we have to make a couple different columns in here. So we're going to do account manager ID, and we'll make that a number, or I'm sorry, that's going to be a varchar 2, because we got to match what the our other table has. And we'll make that a maximum of 10. And then what else do we need? We need the salary, which is going to be a number. We'll make that a 8, 2. And we also need the region, which is going to be a varchar 2. We'll make the length maximum of 2. All right. Just thinking about this, we probably should have a bonus in here too. So let's put bonus amount. I'll make that a number. All right, here we go. So we got a nice basic little table that we'll create. Let's see if it creates our table for us. Oops, missing right parenthesis. I'm missing the right parenthesis. There's my problem. It looks like I mistyped varchar. All right, I think I got everything spelled right here. Let me see if that runs. Okay, so now I've got that table. So now if I select from that table, so what you'll notice is that when you look at this table, if we wanted to, well, there's no columns yet, but the columns, if you recall, are were the account manager ID, right, the AM ID, the AM salary, and the region, and then a bonus that I could put in there. But if I wanted to populate this table, so I'm going to insert into account bonus. So I can insert values into that table. So we want to insert the AM ID, the AM sal, and the region. But instead of inserting them one at a time, I could just do a select statement. So I'm going to do select. Gosh, I don't know what the column names were. So let me look at the. Let me click Find Tables and look up the column names here. Yep. So here he is. So it's AMID, AM sal, and region. Right. So we're going to do AMID, AM sal, and region from account manager. Now first, let me see if it'll let me just select this. Okay, so it's going to select what you see here, right? So I ran just that select statement by highlighting it, which I didn't know you could do in the web browser. That's kind of neat that that works. But if I run this entire statement, it's simply going to run this insert statement, but instead of listing out the values manually, I'm just selecting them from another table. So it'll populate them from another table. So that's doing an insert statement with a subquery. So now if I do my select statement from account bonus, now I have some values. And of course my bonus is null because I didn't insert anything for the bonus. So next I want to show you the update statement. So we know how to insert records now. Let's talk about how to modify those records. This is the basic syntax of an update statement. So you're going to update the table name, then set some column to some value, and then optionally you can put in a where condition. And now I should caution you that if you forget to put this line in, so this is very important, this last line. If you put nothing there, then you're going to have a problem. And let me show you why. So let me put a statement in here for you. Okay, so let's say, I'm going to take out this empty space here. So let's say I wanted to do an update statement that sets the account manager date to 10 October 2009 and the region to S for South. So my intention is probably to only update one of the records. But if I run that statement without the where clause, it doesn't. We're not telling Oracle which row we want to update. So normally in class I would ask, which row do you think it's going to update? If you think about that for a moment, the row that will be updated is all of them, right? It's just going to update everything. That's not typically what we want. So typically we do not want to update all of our rows. We only want to update certain ones. So in this case, I only want to update, let's say, L500, right? So I've got 2 rows with L500, but that's okay. So we'll do where AMID is equal to L500. So this will only update. So this should update just 2 rows, not all 3 rows. Let's see what it does. Okay, there we go. So it updated 2 rows. And if I do my select statement, we should see that reflected. Oops. Okay, so there it is. So we have the correct date now, right? And I changed the date to 10 October 2009, which you can see is here. And I also updated the region to South, which is now populated as S for South. So again, don't forget that where clause. That will ruin your day if you forget the where clause. Now, one of the options they talk about in your book, and I'm just going to show you what this looks like. So this is from your textbook. When you use the ampersand in front of a variable name, right? So really, what this is doing when you put the ampersand in front of a string is to prompt the user to enter something for the region and prompt the user to enter something for the state. And usually you would do this with SQL Plus. We're not using SQL Plus in this class, but SQL Plus is the command line interface to Oracle, where you can do a lot of the stuff that we're doing. Normally, when I teach an Oracle class, we use SQL Plus, not so much the Application Express, which you see here. But Application Express is web-based. What I'm not sure of is if this even works in application. This is my first time trying this. Let's see what it does. I have a feeling it's not going to work, but let's find out. Well, it probably just inserted these values instead of prompting the user. What's supposed to happen, though, is it's supposed to prompt the user to enter a value for these. Now, of course, it didn't update any rows because ampersand state does not exist, right? So there's no value of ampersand state, so it didn't match anything, so it didn't update, which is good. But it didn't do what our book says it's going to do because, again, we're not using SQL Plus. If any of you installed Oracle on your machines rather than using Apex, then you would see that work. All right, I'm going to show you another. Now, there's some more advanced things I should mention that you could do with update, but we're going to talk about some advanced features with update later on. We have to learn about joins and some more complicated concepts before we can circle back and learn about some of the other things we can do with update. But for right now, I think this is probably enough for you to go and make edits to rows in your tables or make changes to your data if you wanted to. And the last thing that you might want to do is delete something. And delete's pretty easy. Let me show you the syntax. It's just delete from table name. You don't list the columns because we're deleting an entire row. You can't just delete an individual column. That would be an update statement, right? If you just wanted to set a column to null or remove a column from a row, that would just be an update to set the column to null. So you do update set column whatever equals null where whatever your condition is. So delete from account manager would delete a row. Now again, this is another place where this is going to ruin your day if you forget a where clause. That where clause would tell it which rows to delete. If you leave that off, by default, it's going to delete all of your rows, which could be bad, right? And I'll talk about in just a second how we can prevent that. But let me go ahead and add a where clause in here. So this will only delete the account manager whose account manager ID is J500. It won't delete any others. So if I run that, it should work. And it deleted one row. So now if I select star from account manager, all right, we're missing J500. So the next thing I want to tell you is what if I forgot this, right? So what if I forgot to type this where clause and I deleted it? Well, if you think about it, if you delete something on accident on your own computer, right? You're doing some work and you accidentally deleted a file that you really needed. Where do we go to get that file? Well, we go to the recycling bin, right? Now, I talked about that concept of using a recycling bin with table creation, right? We talked about dropping and creating tables and how when you drop a table, you could go and recover that table from what is essentially like a recycling bin in Oracle. But with transactions, we can do rollbacks and commits. So I'm gonna put these three keywords up here, but I do want to tell you that that these keywords do not work in the web interface. If we were using SQL Plus, the command line, then I believe all of these would work. But I don't think these work with the web page, and I'll explain why in a second. But basically, a commit means take everything that you've done and make it permanent, right? So if we do a bunch of updates or deletes or inserts and so forth, once we type the commit command, it's going to commit everything that we've done permanently to the database. Now you may ask yourself, well, what happens if I go in and make a bunch of changes, if I do some updates and so forth, and I forget to run the commit and I disconnect or I log off or what have you? Well, if you don't do commit, your transactions will be implicitly committed when you disconnect from the database engine. So as soon as your session is terminated on the, and it doesn't matter how it was terminated. If somehow it got terminated, then everything you've done becomes permanent, and you cannot do a rollback until that time. So until you either type the commit command or do a rollback, um, I'm sorry, until you type the commit command or disconnect from Oracle. One of those two things happens. Until that time, you can do a rollback command. So a rollback is going to reverse all of the things that you've done up to the point that you last ran the commit command. So if I type commit and I hit enter, and I run and execute that command, then everything I've done up to that point gets committed. It's permanent now. And then starting from that point, any additional commands I type, I can roll back up to that commit, but no further back. It'll only run them backwards to that commit. So that's a commit and rollback. If you want, you can, as you're putting commands in, you can put save points in. You can name them. So you can type save point, give it a name, and then you can roll back to a certain point without committing all of your records every once in a while. So that just gives you a kind of a point in time to roll back to without rolling back a bunch of other stuff. So maybe you do a lot of complex commands and you can put that save point in periodically, realize that you need to roll back only to a certain save point, you can do that. And then you can keep typing commands again. So basically it'll roll it back and then you start from there again and you start going down again. So that would be a save point. So again, we have a commit, a rollback, and a save point. And these are for transaction control. Now, again, this is something that we can use when we're using the command line for Oracle. Now, if you remember what I said, when we disconnect the session from Oracle, that's when commit implicitly runs. Now, I'm not 100% sure about this, but I'm fairly certain that when we use this user interface that we're using in a web browser, every time you click that run command, it establishes a connection to Oracle, runs whatever you have in your SQL commands window, and then it disconnects from Oracle. Well, because it disconnects from Oracle when you're done hitting that run command, that means that it's implicitly committed at that point because it's disconnected. So I think we lose a little bit of our transaction control when we're using a web browser. I would love to teach this class and have you guys use SQL Plus so we could demonstrate that, but that would require us to require all of our students to install Oracle, which is simply not feasible in a community college. But if any of you installed Oracle and have access to SQL Plus, you can certainly try that, and you can see how that works. And if you want to see it work, if you want to see a demonstration of it, let me know, and I'll log into one of my production Oracle servers, and I can show you. I can give you a quick demonstration of commit, rollback, and save point. But for sure, that's something important to be aware of in the real world if you're working with. And I can tell you that it's very rare that I use something like Oracle Application Express, this web browser interface. It's great for teaching a class because it gives us a very basic interface that you don't have to install anything because you could just use it over the web. All of that's great, but in the real world, I don't really use something like this very often. I'm usually either using some third-party tool that I can manage the database with, which I could show you some of those if you like. I'll probably do that at the end of the course. I'll show you some of the more advanced tools that most of us use in the real world. Or we're just using the command line, right? So we don't have any of these graphic user interfaces. We're typing everything in the command line, and that's probably more typical for most of us. But in that environment, we can do rollbacks, and then we can do commit and have save points periodically. But again, I don't think it's going to work correctly in the web browser. If it does, I'll stand corrected, but I don't think that it does. There's only one more thing that I need to show you, and I'm not going to show you an example of this because again, it's not really doesn't really work in the web browser. But basically, you can select from a table And you can add this option down here at the bottom. We already learned how to do selects, right? We learned how to do a select statement to select values. I've actually done it in almost every lecture, right? But if you add this keyword to the bottom, it's going to lock that table. So I need to talk about table locking. If you are making any changes to a table, so if you're doing an update, a delete, or an insert, the table is going to get locked during the time that you are doing that transaction. And the reason for locking the table during that transaction is to make sure that we maintain the integrity of our database. One of the things that's really important in the world of Oracle and Microsoft SQL Server and MySQL and so forth, and even PostgreSQL, a lot of these SQL Server or SQL type engines is that, I should say relational database engines, which we talked about in the very first week. What's important about these database engines is data integrity, and one of the ways to maintain that data integrity is making sure that if you're working on a set of records, that you have an exclusive lock on those records. So implicitly, if you're doing an insert, if you're doing an update or doing a delete, because you're making changes, you implicitly have a lock on that table. Now, the thing about doing a select is there's no reason for you to have a lock on the table if you're doing a select, because you're not changing anything. You're just viewing that data, right? But what if you're trying to do something with that data that it's important for you to make sure that no one changes it while your transaction is running? And that's what the for update is going to do. So for update is going to lock that table while you're doing a transaction. So maybe you're going to select this data into some kind of cursor or something. We'll learn about cursors later on, but it's basically a loop if you're into programming languages. So basically it allows you to select these values into sort of into memory. And while you're working with that record set that you got from the database, it locks the table so that you know there's going to be no changes during the time that you're working with those records. So that's what the for update is for. I'm not really going to demonstrate that, but I wanted to make sure that you understand that that's also an option. All right, so the things that I talked about in this video, I talked about how to insert records. I showed you a couple different sorry about the dog barking in the background, by the way. So I showed you how to insert records. I showed you how to some different syntax with that, how to deal with nulls. We looked at that command or the syntax to modify the column so that the default, if you insert null, you can set the default value on null. But if you recall, the version of Oracle that we're using for this class is 11, which doesn't yet support that. You'd have to go to version 12. And then I talked about doing insert statements from a subquery, right? So we did an insert statement and then used the subquery to populate those records instead of typing them in one row at a time with our value statement. And then we also talked about doing updates. I also talked about delete, and I stressed the importance of making sure you have a where clause when you're doing an update or a delete. If you forget the where clause, it's going to ruin your day, especially if you're using Apex, because we can't roll back, as we learned, which is the transaction management that I talked about last. All right, so that's it for this unit. So that's basically what you need to know. And if you have any questions, please contact me.